who left a comment under the vagus nerve video that stopped me. She wrote that she is recovering from a stroke, and she asked about the science of stroke recovery and why it feels like an altered state. That phrase, altered state, is exact. Every person who has experienced a stroke or watched someone they love recover from one knows that description is not metaphor. The world looks different, thoughts arrive differently, the sense of self feels shifted, sometimes profoundly. For decades, the medical explanation offered to stroke survivors was functional. Your brain was damaged, it is healing, give it time. That explanation is accurate as far as it goes. What it leaves out is the physics. What is actually happening electrically, chemically, and structurally in the brain during and after a stroke, why the altered state is a precise consequence of specific physical events, and why recovery is one of the most extraordinary examples of biological physics in all of medicine. There is a phenomenon called diastasis, a word most stroke survivors have never heard. That explains the altered state more completely than anything else in neuroscience. There is a window of heightened plasticity that opens after a stroke, driven by a molecule called BDNF, that resembles the critical periods of early childhood brain development. And there is a finding from motor cortex mapping that shows the brain literally redrawing its own geography in response to damage, measurably, in millimeters, in response to the effort the survivor puts into recovery. All of it comes later. Start with what a stroke actually is, because the physics of the first minutes determines everything that follows. A stroke is a vascular event. In approximately 85% of cases, it is ischemic. A clot blocks blood flow to a region of brain tissue. In the remaining 15%, it is hemorrhagic. A blood vessel ruptures and bleeds into or around the brain. In both cases, the fundamental event is identical. A region of brain tissue loses the oxygen and glucose it requires to maintain its electrical activity. Brain is the most metabolically demanding organ in the body, 2% of body mass consuming 20% of total metabolic energy. And it has essentially no reserves. Unlike muscle, which stores glycogen for sustained activity, neurons operate on moment-to-moment delivery. They are running on a supply line, not a fuel tank. When that supply line is cut, the consequences are immediate and sequential. Within seconds of blood flow interruption, neurons in the affected region begin to lose their membrane potential, the carefully maintained electrical gradient across the cell membrane that makes neural signaling possible. Sodium-potassium pumps that maintain this gradient require ATP, and ATP generation halts when oxygen delivery stops. Within minutes, the membrane potential collapses entirely. Calcium floods into cells through voltage-gated channels that can no longer be regulated. The calcium influx triggers a cascade of destructive enzyme activation. Proteases that digest structural proteins, lipases that dissolve membrane lipids, endonucleases that fragment DNA, dismantling the cell from within. At the center of the affected region, neurons die within minutes of blood flow cessation. This central zone of irreversible damage is called the infarct core. Speed of this sequence, measured in minutes, not hours, is why the clinical phrase "time is brain" is not a slogan. Every minute of delayed treatment during an ischemic stroke costs approximately 1.9 million neurons, 13.8 billion synapses, and 12 kilometers of myelinated nerve fibers. The brain is not slowly declining during a stroke. It is undergoing a rapid, precisely sequenced physical collapse in the region deprived of flow, running on the same thermodynamic physics that governs every cell in the body when its energy supply is cut. Now, the region that determines recovery. Because surrounding the infarct core is a territory that is damaged but not yet dead. Ischemic penumbra, the border zone around the infarct core, receives reduced but not absent blood flow through collateral vessels. Arteries in the brain interconnect through anastomoses that can partially supply a region whose primary vessel is blocked. Neurons in the penumbra are electrically silent. They have lost enough membrane potential to stop firing action potentials, but they retain enough ATP to maintain basic cellular integrity. They are in suspended function, not death. Penumbra is the territory that determines everything. If blood flow is restored quickly enough, through thrombolysis dissolving the clot chemically or mechanical thrombectomy physically removing it, penumbral neurons can resume function. They were off, not dead. If flow is not restored, the penumbra progressively recruits into the infarct core over hours as ATP reserves deplete and the destructive calcium cascade extends outward from the center. First hours matter more than any other period in stroke medicine. The penumbra is time limited. Every minute that passes without flow restoration is a minute during which viable neurons at the border of the infarct are depleting their last ATP reserves and crossing from recoverable to permanent damage. The emergency room that delivers thrombolysis within 60 minutes of symptom onset is not merely treating quickly, it is racing the penumbra, trying to restore flow before the viable border tissue exhausts its energy reserves and joins the infarct core. Two strokes of apparently similar location and size can produce dramatically different functional outcomes, and the penumbra is the primary reason. It is not a fixed boundary. It is a dynamic one, shifting as collateral blood flow varies, as brain swelling changes tissue pressure, as the body's own fibrinolytic mechanisms work to dissolve the clot from the inside. The stroke survivor who recovered more function than expected was, in part, someone whose penumbra remained viable long enough for flow to be restored or for collateral supply to compensate. This is not luck in the casual sense. It is hemodynamics, the physics of blood flow through a system with built-in redundancy operating under emergency conditions. Family member who watched someone lose speech or movement in the first hours and then saw partial return in the days that followed. That return was penumbral neurons coming back online. They were never dead. They were electrically silent, running on residual ATP, waiting for flow. When flow returned, or when collateral vessels expanded to compensate, the neurons resumed function. The recovery that seemed miraculous was physics. The penumbra survived. Well, and here is the phenomenon that explains Sue's altered state most directly. Because the damage at the stroke site is only part of what changes. The rest of the brain changes too. Konstantin von Monaco described it in 1914 and named it diaskesis, from the Greek for shock throughout. The principle is specific. Damage to one region of the brain causes functional suppression in anatomically distant but connected regions, not through direct damage but through the loss of the electromagnetic signals those distant regions depend on. Every region of the brain receives continuous input from connected regions through white matter tracks, the physical cables of the neural network. This tonic input, the background electrical activity arriving from distant areas, maintains each region's baseline excitability and its readiness to function. When a stroke destroys neurons in one area, the regions those neurons projected to suddenly lose their tonic input. They do not lose their own neurons. They lose the electrical signal their neurons needed to maintain their normal operating state. Result is a temporary functional shutdown in regions that are physically intact and structurally undamaged, regions that may be centimeters or even the full hemisphere away from the stroke site. PET and fMRI studies of acute stroke consistently show reduced metabolic activity and reduced blood flow in regions remote from the infarct. The cerebellum on the opposite side from a cortical stroke shows diaskesis. The thalamus, the brain's central relay station, connected to virtually every cortical region, shows diaskesis after cortical strokes. The contralateral cortex, the mirror image region on the other side, shows diaskesis after large unilateral strokes. Altered state that stroke survivors describe. The sense that the world is different, that thinking is different, that the self feels shifted, is diaskesis. The brain did not only lose the functions of the damaged region, it lost the electromagnetic scaffold that held the whole network in its normal operating state. Intact regions are running without the background electrical signal they were built to receive. Stroke survivors often report changes that seem unrelated to the location of their stroke. A stroke in the motor cortex that affected the right hand can produce changes in attention, in emotional processing, in the quality of visual experience, changes that have nothing to do with hand movement, but everything to do with the loss of tonic input to the networks connected to the damaged region. The person is not imagining these changes. The diascisis is real, and it affects regions that the medical team may not have discussed because they were not directly damaged. You see, the altered state is the whole brain experiencing itself from inside a changed electromagnetic environment. It is real, it is physical, and it resolves, slowly, over weeks, as the network finds new sources of tonic input and the acute suppression lifts. Diascisis resolution is what clinicians call spontaneous recovery. It is not spontaneous. It is the brain's intact regions coming back online as the electromagnetic environment normalizes. The functions that return first are often the functions that were lost through diascisis rather than through direct damage. They return because the neurons that perform them were never destroyed, only silenced. And then, a second wave of damage that extends the injury beyond the original vascular event, because dying neurons do something to their neighbors that makes the stroke worse than the blood flow interruption alone. In the hours following a stroke, neurons dying in the infarct core release their contents into the surrounding extracellular space, including glutamate, the brain's primary excitatory neurotransmitter. Glutamate in the synapse is normally cleared within milliseconds by transporter proteins that pump it back into neurons and glial cells. But the transporters require ATP, and in ischemic tissue, ATP is depleted. Glutamate accumulates. It floods the receptors on neighboring neurons, NMDA and AMPA receptors that were not designed to be activated at this concentration. Massive overstimulation through these receptors drives calcium influx into neurons that were not in the infarct core. Healthy neurons adjacent to the damage zone, neurons that the original vascular event never reached. The calcium triggers the same destructive enzyme cascade that killed the core neurons. The brain's own primary signaling molecule, at sufficiently high concentration, becomes the most potent neurotoxin in the brain's immediate environment. John Olney at Washington University coined the term excitotoxicity in 1969 after observing this mechanism in animal models. The stroke converts a neurotransmitter into a weapon. The physics of receptor saturation, a dose-response relationship that becomes destructive above a threshold, produces secondary damage in tissue that survived the original event. Excitotoxic damage is the reason strokes continue to worsen in the hours after onset, even when blood flow to the core has been restored. The dying tissue poisons the surviving tissue adjacent to it. The penumbra, the territory that was holding on, electrically silent but structurally intact, is under attack from two directions: loss of blood flow from below, glutamate flooding from above. The time window for penumbral salvage is, in part, a race against excitotoxicity. The spreading wave of glutamate-driven calcium overload that extends the infarct core outward into tissue that was never directly deprived of blood. That mechanism is the one I found hardest to sit with, because it means the brain's own communication system is what extends the damage. The molecule the brain uses for every thought, every movement, every sensation, every memory. Glutamate, the primary currency of neural communication, is the molecule that extends the damage when the system loses the energy to clear it from the synaptic space. The strength of the signal becomes the weapon. The more active the region was before the stroke, the more glutamate it stored, and the more excitotoxic damage it can inflict on its neighbors. Destruction first. Now the reconstruction. And here is where the physics reverses, because within days of the catastrophe, the brain initiates a response that is the opposite of the damage cascade. Neurons in the peri-infarct zone, the region immediately surrounding the permanent damage, begin upregulating brain-derived neurotrophic factor at levels that exceed anything seen in the normal adult brain. BDNF is the primary molecular signal for synaptic plasticity. It drives the growth of new dendritic spines, the tiny protrusions on neurons where synaptic connections form. It strengthens existing synapses. It promotes the formation of entirely new synaptic connections. It activates TrkA-B receptors on surviving neurons, triggering intracellular signaling cascades that change gene expression and structural protein synthesis. Post-stroke BDNF surge creates a window of heightened plasticity that researchers have described as resembling the critical periods of early childhood brain development. the windows when the infant brain is most rapidly rewiring in response to experience. That comparison is not casual. The molecular mechanisms are identical. The BDNF concentrations are comparable. The rate of synaptic formation and elimination, the turnover that characterizes a brain actively reorganizing, is similarly elevated. The adult brain after a stroke is, in the peri-infarct region, running the same plasticity program that built the brain's original architecture in childhood. The difference is that in childhood the program was building from a blank template, laying down circuits that had never existed, connecting regions that had never communicated. After a stroke, it is rebuilding around a permanent loss, routing new connections around dead tissue, reassigning functions to regions that were built for other purposes, improvising solutions to problems the developmental program never anticipated. The childhood brain had the advantage of a blank canvas. The post-stroke brain has the advantage of an existing network with decades of established connections that can be rerouted. Neither advantage is absolute. Both produce results that, measured in synaptic connections formed per day, are comparable, heavy in plasticity under emergency conditions. Donald Hebb's principle, neurons that fire together wire together, is the physics of all learning, all memory, all skill acquisition. After a stroke, identical mechanism operates at an accelerated rate, driven by the BDNF surge in tissue that is simultaneously stressed and primed for reorganization. The circuits that survived are being recruited to take over functions that were lost. Adjacent cortex is being drafted into new roles. Contralateral regions are expanding their functional territory. Reorganization is measurable on fMRI as early as days after the stroke. Regions that never represented certain functions begin showing activation when those functions are attempted. The brain is reassigning roles in real time, driven by demand. Window is real, and it is finite. Plasticity elevation gradually returns to baseline over weeks to months, which is why the intensity of rehabilitation effort in the early post-stroke period determines outcomes in ways that effort months later cannot fully replicate. Physics does not care about the patient's mood, their motivation, or their belief in recovery. It cares about co-activation, repeated firing of the neurons being recruited, repeated practice of the functions being recovered, repeated demand placed on the circuits being reorganized. Each attempt, however frustrating, however imperfect, physically strengthens the synaptic connections that the attempt activated. The effort is not psychological, it is molecular. Here is what the stroke survivor needs to understand about the exhaustion of rehabilitation. The profound fatigue that follows an hour of physiotherapy or speech therapy, the tiredness that seems disproportionate to the physical effort involved. The brain is not merely exercising existing circuits, it is building new ones. Synaptogenesis, the formation of new synaptic connections, is one of the most metabolically expensive processes the brain performs. The BDNF-driven plasticity of the post-stroke window is consuming glucose and oxygen at rates that approach the metabolic demands of early childhood brain development. The survivor who is exhausted after 30 minutes of rehabilitation is not weak. They are running a construction project in their cortex that is consuming energy at developmental rates in a brain that is simultaneously managing a damaged network. The fatigue is proportional to the work the physics is doing. And here is how the brain redraws its own map, because this is where the physics of recovery becomes visible. Motor cortex contains a topographic map of the body. The homunculus, first described by Wilder Penfield, in which specific cortical regions correspond to specific body parts. The map is not fixed. It has never been fixed. The hand representation in a professional pianist is measurably larger than in a non-musician. The reading finger representation in a braille reader is expanded relative to the other fingers. The map has always been activity-dependent, plastic, responsive to demand. After a stroke damages part of the motor cortex, surviving adjacent cortex begins expanding into the territory vacated by the damage. This expansion is driven by activity, not by passive time. Motor attempts. The effortful and often frustrating attempts to move a limb that rehabilitation demands generate neural firing in the peri-infarct motor cortex that triggers Hebbian strengthening of surviving synapses and growth of new connections into the damaged territory's former domain. Transcranial magnetic stimulation studies mapping motor cortex in stroke survivors show progressive shifts in the cortical representation of affected body parts over weeks of recovery, the representation moving from the damaged zone into adjacent surviving tissue measurably in millimeters, driven by repeated motor attempts. The brain is not healing the damaged tissue. It is redrawing the map around the damage. The geography changes, the function moves. One more finding, one that adds a second source of the activation. The remapping depends on. When a person watches another person perform a movement, the observer's motor cortex activates. Specifically, the regions that would be activated if the observer were performing the movement themselves. This is the mirror neuron system, identified by Giacomo Rizzolatti's group in Parma, and in stroke rehabilitation, it has direct practical implications. A stroke survivor whose motor cortex is damaged can activate surviving motor cortex circuitry, the circuits adjacent to the damage that are being recruited for remapping. By watching another person perform the movement they are trying to recover, the visual input of movement, processed through the mirror neuron system, drives motor cortex activation in the hemisphere attempting recovery. Watching is doing at the level of cortical activation. Mirror therapy. Placing a mirror between the arms and watching the reflection of the unaffected arm moving while attempting movement with the affected arm works through exactly this mechanism. The brain is using visual information about movement as a proxy for the motor command signal it can no longer generate efficiently from the damaged cortex. The brain finds a different path to activation that the Hebbian mechanism can then strengthen. Observation and attempt together produce stronger remapping than either alone. The brain responds to the activation itself, regardless of whether it was generated by a motor command or by a visual signal processed through the mirror system. For a stroke survivor working through rehabilitation, repeating the same movement hundreds of times, watching the therapist demonstrate the movement they are attempting, reaching for a cup they cannot yet grasp, attempting words that will not yet form. The frustration is real, but the physics underneath it is precise. Each attempt generates a firing pattern. Each observation generates a firing pattern. Each firing pattern strengthens the synaptic connections it activates. Each strengthened connection shifts the cortical map by a fraction of a millimeter. Map does not move in response to intention. It moves in response to activation. The trying is the mechanism. The watching adds to it. Movement that fails on the 100th attempt and succeeds on the 101st did not succeed because of perseverance in the motivational sense. It succeeded because the 100 previous attempts had collectively strengthened the synaptic connections in the remapped cortex to the point where the neural command finally exceeded the threshold required to produce the motor output. The 100 failures were not failures. They were the construction phase. The success was the moment the construction reached functional capacity. Every attempt before it was load-bearing. Now, what all of it adds up to. Diakisis has suppressed the tonic electromagnetic input that held the whole brain's network in its normal operating state. Glutamate, excitotoxicity, has damaged neurons adjacent to the primary infarct, altering the chemical environment of the surviving tissue. The BDNF surge has elevated plasticity to developmental levels, making the brain simultaneously more responsive and less stable than normal. The cortical map is literally shifting, moving functions into new territories, changing the relationship between neural address and neural function. And the thalamus, connected to essentially every cortical region, is almost certainly running in a state of diastasis, altering the routing of sensory and cognitive signals throughout the cortex. Every component of the altered state has a name, a mechanism, and a measurable physical substrate. The world looks different because the visual processing stream is receiving changed thalamic input. Thinking feels different because the prefrontal cortex is operating in a changed electromagnetic environment. The sense of self feels shifted because the default mode network, the system most associated with self-referential processing, is receiving altered input from multiple diastases, affected regions simultaneously. Alteration is real. It is total. And it resolves, slowly, imperfectly, but measurably. As diascoses lifts, as the plasticity window drives remapping, as the network finds new equilibria around the permanent damage. The resolution is not uniform. Some aspects of the altered state resolve in weeks. The diascoses-driven suppression of distant regions lifts as the acute inflammatory response subsides and the network's electromagnetic environment stabilizes. Some aspects resolve over months. The cortical remapping and contralateral recruitment progressively restore functions that were lost not to their original form, but to a reorganized form that may feel slightly different from the pre-stroke experience. And some aspects do not fully resolve. The permanent loss of the infar core means the network will never return to its exact pre-stroke topology. The new equilibrium is a new brain, organized differently, routing differently, experiencing itself differently. The altered state does not fully disappear. It evolves into a new normal that the survivor gradually stops experiencing as altered because it becomes the baseline. Altered state is not confusion. It is not psychological reaction to illness. It is the physics of a brain whose network topology has been suddenly changed, experiencing itself from inside the changed network. There is no other way it could feel. Recovery from stroke is not the healing of damaged neurons. Dead neurons do not regenerate in the adult human brain. The infarct is permanent. The tissue that died in the first minutes will now return. What recovery is, physically, is the reorganization of surviving tissue to take over the functions of what is gone. 4 mechanisms running simultaneously. Diascoses resolution. Intact distant regions coming back online as the acute electromagnetic suppression lifts, producing the spontaneous recovery of the first weeks. Cortical remapping. Adjacent surviving cortex, expanding into new functional territory, driven by Hebbian plasticity and the BDNF window, producing the recovery that depends on practice and effort. Contralateral recruitment. The undamaged hemisphere contributing increasingly to functions previously dominated by the damaged one, drawing on latent capacity that the healthy brain never needed to use and the catastrophe revealed. And white matter remodeling. Surviving neurons extending new axonal projections toward the regions they are being recruited to serve, new cables being laid to connect the reorganized network. You see, none of these mechanisms require the survivor to understand them. All of them require the survivor to use the brain, to attempt the movements, to practice the words, to engage the cognitive functions, because every mechanism listed runs on neural activity. The plasticity is not passive. It is driven by demand. The Hebbian strengthening requires coactivation. The remapping requires repeated attempts. The contralateral recruitment requires bilateral engagement. The physics of recovery is the physics of use. Recovery does not end when the acute plasticity window closes. The window represents the period of maximum reorganization speed. The weeks when the BDNF-driven plasticity is strongest and the cortical map is most malleable. After the window narrows, plasticity continues at the brain's normal adult rate. Slower, less dramatic, but real. Stroke survivors continue to recover function months and years after the acute period, driven by the same Hebbian mechanisms that produce all learning. The improvement at month 12 is slower than the improvement at week 4, but it is running on identical physics. The brain does not stop reorganizing. It reorganizes at its normal rate rather than its emergency rate. The effort still matters. The practice still builds connections. The map still moves. Sue asks why stroke recovery feels like an altered state. The answer is that she is living inside a brain whose entire network topology changed in a single vascular event. A brain whose electromagnetic environment was disrupted globally by the loss of a local node, whose chemical environment was flooded with its own neurotransmitters, turned toxic, whose cartography is literally shifting as surviving tissue takes over new functions, whose plasticity is running at levels it has not reached since childhood. The strangeness she feels is not a sign that something is going wrong. It is a sign that the reorganization is happening. The altered state is the felt experience of a brain in the process of remapping. And a brain that was not remapping would not feel altered. It would feel static. The alteration is the physics of recovery experienced from the inside. Altered state is not a symptom of illness in the psychological sense. It is the felt experience of a brain doing the most extraordinary thing a brain can do, rebuilding itself around damage, rerouting signals through new paths, redrawing its own map in response to catastrophic loss. Every moment of recovery, every word that comes back, every movement that returns, every thought that arrives more clearly than the day before, is Hebbian physics operating under emergency conditions. The mechanism that learned everything you know is learning how to be you again. That is the most remarkable thing the physics of the brain has ever been asked to do.